Good evening. It's good to be back up here. I came up here this afternoon and was standing up here just looking over my sermon, and I looked up. I realized it's been a while. It looked a little weird to look at the pews like that. Then I hopped up here because I got bored of standing here. So I hopped up here and I looked out and I realized I've never been up there. And so if I hop up there randomly tonight, y'all just keep cool, okay? Might happen. Might switch it up a bit, but I think I'll stay on here for now. Maybe next time. I also realized that sermon series don't work super well when you do the first one and then don't do the next part of the series for like a month, however long it's been since I preached. So this we're going to review for a bit before we dive into the second part. But last time we started this series, I said it was going to be a 2-part series. It's going to be at least a 3-part series. But this is the second part of this series. And we started it, it's four sections of the series. They're up on the screen now. Contradictions and categories, convictions, and contemplations. So last time we talked about the first 2 of these. First, we talked about contradictions. Go to the next one if you will, Ken. And then, so just to do a very quick recap of what this was about. We have 2 verses on the screen. One from Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, and then one from 1 Corinthians 10, 32 and 33. Now, if you read these verses, you're going to notice that there seems to be a contradiction just in these very simple phrases. On the one hand, Paul says, if I were still trying to please people, I wouldn't be a servant of Jesus. I wouldn't be an apostle if I were trying to please people. He says that in Galatians. Well, then the same person, Paul, writes to the Corinthians. He says that I try to please, not just I try to please some people, I try to please literally everybody in everything I do. So how is this possible? How do these 2 things fit together? There seems to be a contradiction. Last time we looked at several texts that look like this, where he says one thing in one, and then seems to say the complete opposite in the other. So those are the contradictions. And then we looked at the categories. We presented 4 of these that hopefully will help us begin to think through these contradictions and trying to resolve, if you remember the rubber band. Visual thinking helps me. So if you remember the rubber band, where we have this tension, where we're trying to figure out how all of this fits together, and we feel this tension. And what we don't want to do is let one side slip to where we have no strength in the rubber band. We also don't want to let the other side slip. We want to hold both sides of whatever's going on here in the proper biblical tension. So to help us think through that, we had these 4 categories that were citizens of this world, but also refugees in this world, that were separate from the world, but we also participate in the world. We are supposed to confront the world, but also adapt to the world, and that we're in the world, but not of the world. Now, all of those, to me at least, seem pretty contradictory on the surface. So we're trying to work through them. And remember that we said the main category is that first one. We're citizens, but refugees. And that's especially applicable, I think, in light of what's going on in our world right now, where we have so many people who are refugees because of the war, but even just life in a lot of other countries. There are so many refugees in our world right now. I hope it doesn't mind me saying this. I'll keep it very general. But I was talking with my friend who some of y'all have helped support financially, who was displaced in Ukraine, the preacher. I was talking to him this week, and he said that life as a refugee he wasn't complaining, he was just being real. He said it's harder than I ever would have guessed. Because not only do you have the very real physical problems of, trying to have a place to live and trying to eat and those kind of things, but really the harder part, he seemed to say, was the mental side of it, to where you're just completely unstable in your life. You have no idea where you're going. You have no idea what's happening. You have family and friends who you don't know, if they're alive, et cetera, et cetera. So being a refugee is not comfortable, but it's what we're called to be here in this life. And on the next slide, we have a couple verses that illustrate this, that we're citizens, but also refugees. We're citizens of heaven, right? So that that means we're citizens there, but we're also citizens here in a very literal sense. Everybody in here probably is a citizen of the United States of America. And if you're not, you're probably a citizen of somewhere else. So we're very literally citizens here. But we're also refugees. Peter says that we're strangers and pilgrims. We're not at home here. We sing that. This world is not my home. So we have these categories that hopefully help us begin to work through this tension. But as we tonight move into the third section of our series, talking about some convictions, I want us to ask the question, where does this tension come from? Why do we have these verses that seem to contradict each other? Why do we feel this tension in our Christian walk? I think a lot of it comes down to four convictions that we'll talk about tonight. Now, as I've been working on this sermon this week and thinking through it, I've been thinking through it as something like parenting, which obviously is something that I, with no children, know a ton about. But so bear with me. But I've been thinking about it in terms of parenting, where hypothetically, let's say I'm a parent and I tell my child not to touch the hot stove, right? That's the classic. Don't touch the hot stove. Well, my child is, this is hypothetical. This child is perfect. He doesn't touch the hot stove, okay? Looking great so far. Okay, so the child knows not to do that. And if he does do it, then he's going to really know not to do that, right? So he's not going to touch the hot stove. But if I only tell him not to do that, he's not going to know why he's not supposed to touch the hot stove. He's not going to know that if we're dividing this into two categories, number one, I care about him, and that because of number one. Number two, I don't want him to be in unnecessary and unhealthy pain, right? Those are the two motivations behind that. So if he doesn't know those two motivations, if he doesn't know why he's not supposed to touch the hot stove, then he won't know to apply those same principles to other areas of life. So maybe my child grows up and he's not so perfect anymore and he gets caught up in gang life and he's just having a rough time in life. And he's faced with a decision where he can either do something that is illegal and might cause him or others pain, or he can choose not to do that. And if he never gets those principles behind why he shouldn't touch the hot stove, then he's not going to have, or not going to be able to reason through this situation in the same way that I hope he can reason through this situation. So I don't know if that makes total sense. Like I said, not a parent here, but hypothetically, that's how I'm approaching this, where these convictions are the underlying assumptions that govern where we're going to go in the contemplations part of this, the last part. So hopefully this will help us as we go through life. We have this reasoning behind why we do what we do. If you notice in Paul's epistles, he does this all the time. In Ephesians, there's a very clean break. Same thing in Romans, where in Ephesians, the first 3 chapters, Paul lays out this very doctrine-heavy, intellectual side. And then in chapters 4 through 6, there's a drastic switch to the practical side of Christianity. He almost always does that in his epistles, where he lays out, here's who we are and why we are, and then here's what we are and how we act. So that's what I'm hoping to do, is give the why and the how, and so then we can go from that to real life next week. All right, 4 convictions. First Christian conviction that gives rise to this tension has to do with creation. Creation. Hop in a time machine, that's also an airplane, with me, all right? We're going back to 1st century Corinth. Now, in 1st century Corinth, let's pretend that you're an idolater. So you're not my perfect child. You're making bad decisions right now. Don't do this. But you're an idolater, right? So you're going to take your cow. Let's say your cow's name is Bessie. Sounds like a cow. So your cow's name is Bessie. And you're taking Bessie and you're going to sacrifice Bessie to your idol Friday afternoon. All right? So this Friday afternoon, you're taking Bessie to the temple for a pagan priest to sacrifice her to an idol. So what happens? Well, the priest sacrifices Bessie. You go home and you expect all the blessings that come to you because you've sacrificed to this false god who you don't know is a false god. Now, what happens to Bessie at that point? Well, it seems that the priest has at least a couple of options on what to do with your cow. Either he can throw the cow into like a garbage dump somewhere, which is going to cost him time and effort and maybe money if he has to rent space. So he can do that. Or he can go with option B. Behind door number 2 is a much better choice, it seems. He can take that cow, that roasted cow, and he can sell it to a marketplace. And that marketplace can then sell it to the people, and so everybody wins, right? He doesn't have to deal with storing it, getting rid of it. He just sells it. He makes a little profit. They get profit. We get meat for these regular people. So everybody wins. That's kind of the best solution to this dilemma. But here's the problem. If Bessie is sacrificed to an idol on Friday afternoon, and on Saturday morning, she's in the marketplace with a price tag hanging from her, you can buy her and take her home and eat. That's a moral dilemma for a Jesus follower. Do you see why? Because she was just sacrificed to an idol, like to the literal opposite of everything that a Christian stands for. And by purchasing Bessie, I'm just going to call her a cow. This is bothering me. By purchasing this cow, okay, you're at least indirectly helping this system keep going, right? You're giving money to this idolatrous system. Even if the money isn't going directly to this idolatrous priest, you're at least helping this system keep going, because if nobody's buying it, well, the priest isn't going to be selling it to the marketplace. So what does the Christian do in this situation? What does a person who is a citizen but also a refugee do? Well, I think for a lot of us, our natural instinct is to say, I'm taking my stand right here. I'm a Christian, and I don't support idolatry, right? That's not what we're about in any way. So I'm going to take my stand. I'll go around to the other marketplace that sells the more expensive meat, and I'll buy it there. It'll cost me more, but I'm a Christian, and that's what my convictions say to do. I think that's our natural response for a lot of us, and that's, I think, a respectable response. But turn to 1 Corinthians 10, and notice Paul's solution to this dilemma, and then we're going to notice his reasoning behind it. By the way, we're going to spend most of our time on this first conviction, so don't get scared if we're most of the way in and we're still on point number 1, creation. So 1 Corinthians 10, remember that we're talking about first century Corinth. They're facing this moral dilemma on whether to buy this cow that was sacrificed to an idol or not. So Paul is going to say something that, for me, if I'm coming at this trying to pretend like I've never read this before, is pretty surprising. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 25, Paul says, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Wait, what? Paul says, buy it. Eat it. It's just meat. Just buy it and eat it. Don't ask questions. Just do it. Well, that's weird, but notice his reasoning behind it. He says, because, buy the meat and eat it, because the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. So he's rooting this Christian freedom to buy and eat this meat. He's rooting that freedom in creation. He's saying God made that meat. That's God's meat. People eat it as God's meat. They worship with it as God's meat. They own it as God's meat. It's His. An idol can't take that meat and taint it or claim it as its own. No matter what we do, that cow belongs to God because He created it. He's the boss over all of this. So because God owns it, you as His citizen, as His child, you can eat it. So that's His reasoning. But on the other hand, flip back a few pages to Romans chapter 8. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians a lot, especially in this first point. But I want you to see something in Romans chapter 8. So that's the one side of this. We're citizens. Our king owns that meat. Therefore, we can eat that meat. It's ours to eat. We're sons, we're daughters, and our Father owns that meat. Therefore, we own that meat. We can eat it if we want to. But there's another side to this. And this is where it gets fun for me. I love thinking through stuff like this. Romans chapter 8. In verse 20, notice this little phrase, for the creation was subjected to futility. So when God first created all of this, it was good, right? Straight from Genesis 1 and 2. Creation was good. It was pristine. It was what He wanted it to be. That's Genesis 1 and 2. But then in Genesis 3, what happens? The fall. Adam and Eve, they sin. And fast forward And all these years later, every single human who has existed since then has also sinned, including everybody in this room. So because of their sin, because of our sin, the creation, the world itself, Paul says, has been subjected to futility. Our world is fallen. It's broken. If you look in verse 22, he says the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. So creation belongs to God, but it's also fallen. It's broken. It's in need of redemption. I was looking over my sermon sitting in my car. Apparently I've just looked over it everywhere today. I was sitting in my car over here in the corner of the parking lot, and I was looking at our field back here. You know, we have this field that's pretty much empty of anything right here, but then there's pretty much jungle right there. I mean, the contrast is so stark, where it's this nice field, and then, I mean, you won't be able to walk. You need a machete to go through where I was looking at. Well, why is there a difference there? Because left alone, that's what creation does. Because it's broken. It grows thorns and thistles and briars. It's not suitable for our habitation. Now, we can tame it. We're supposed to have dominion over the earth, and we do. But if we leave it alone, all of you people who take pride in your lawns, if you leave your lawn alone, what's going to happen? It's going to look closer to that than to that, right? Because this is what happens. Our world is broken. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 31, the present form of this world is passing away. It's rotting. We're refugees here, and that's a good thing because the ground on which we stand is rotting away. So on the one hand, we have creation is mine, and you are my child. So do whatever you want with it. But then on the other hand, we have it's broken, it's passing away, so be careful. Now, why is it important that we have both of these truths in mind? Because if the only truth that we hold to is number one, that God is my Father, He owns this, so I can do what I want, then I can walk into a candy store and steal whatever I want, or Bass Pro Shops, or Bath and Body Works, if that's your type of thing. We can just walk in there and take whatever we want because it's God's anyways, right? So we might as well have it. Better off us using it than it just sitting in there. But that's not the only truth. The other truth is that our world is broken. There's something different at play here. Now, back in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 this time. Turn there with me and notice what happens when Paul applies this second truth, that creation is broken. He applies that truth to meat, to where we started. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 13. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food. Now, it seems like Paul is quoting some people in Corinth here. These people seem to be saying, or they seem to be a bit too comfortable in this world that's broken. They're saying, look, the food is meant for stomach, and the stomach is meant for food. So, I mean, they're made for each other. Therefore, I'm going to eat whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. I'm just going to live it out because why not? That's what it's meant for. Paul says, fair enough, but the next phrase, and God will destroy both one and the other. In other words, don't make that one truth the whole truth. Because when you say that that food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, that this is how it's meant to be, that's true, but it's ignoring the other side of this equation. There's more at play here than just that one truth. It was and it is a gray area. It required nuance and discretion and discernment. Not everything is so black and white. There's a lot of gray area in between. Now, I want to share with you a real-life, practical, modern, concrete example of where this conviction about creation and the two sides of it are affecting my life. And some of you are probably in this same boat. Most of you are not. But I think by talking through a real-life example of this, I think it can help all of us reason to our real-life situations. So, on the one hand, if we're going by God's creation order, how He originally intended all of this to be, we would say that everybody should be married. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. God says it's not good that the man should be alone, so He creates a helper fit for him. He creates Eve. So before we fell into sin, in God's creation order, everything ideal, It's not good that man should be alone. Everybody should be married. But then we get to 1 Corinthians 7, where redemption is in the picture. The fall has happened. Genesis 3 is in between Genesis 2 and 1 Corinthians 7, right? So the fall has happened. The world is broken. There are some other things at play here. And let's see how that same principle of marriage is applied in 1 Corinthians 7. I'm going to camp out here for a bit. Just read some verses. So read with me beginning in verse 6. Paul writes, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each as his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another." So he just said, I wish that everybody was like me, right? He just said that. Now, what did he mean by that? "To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am." Paul says, I wish everybody was single. Keep reading. "But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So on the one hand, in Genesis chapter 2, it's not good that man should be alone. Everybody should be married. But then, Jesus is single, never married. And Paul is single, never married. So how does that work? This is all a guilt trip for you guys who are married. No, not actually. But we're working through this. Let's think through. There are multiple truths at play. We could say that we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not in the garden. There's a lot that's going on because our world is broken. Drop down to verse 32, and we're going to read several verses here. Paul's continuing this thought about singleness. He says, "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided." Now, that's just very practical, right? When you're married, your life isn't all about you anymore. Hopefully none of our lives are about us, but in a very practical sense, your life becomes divided. So I've heard, okay? And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you. He's saying, I'm not trying to make this harder on you. I'm not trying to guilt any of y'all, right? He's just saying, let's think through this. But to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. You see him going back and forth almost in this text. He's saying, look, if you want to get married, if you need to get married, it's good to get married. And we would all say that. It's a good thing to be married. But then he has this other side where he's like, but I'm also better than you. No, because he said, I wish you were all like me, right? He's going back and forth here. Paul says, look, God keeps dragging me around here and there and everywhere, and it wouldn't be fair to a wife to have her try to follow after me and all that God is doing in my life. So there's a balance here, and Paul is falling on one side. But notice that, remember verse 31, you can look at it again, we just read it, about how the world is passing away. This reasoning is in light of that creation truth, that it was created beautifully, it was good, but also it's fallen now. We have to remember both of those things. So in verse 26 of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. So Paul says, are you married? Don't try to get out of it. Are you single? Don't try to get into it. Just remain as you are. Why? Because of this present distress that's going on. Now, as we bring it into our world, I think it's fair to say that if we aren't there already, this phrase, present distress, is at least becoming very applicable to our world. And it's only going to become more and more so, it seems. Now, for me, especially in my line of work that I hope to do for the rest of my life, that could mean very real ramifications. Prison, that kind of thing. I have no idea, but it could mean that. And that would have ramifications for a potential family, right? So for me, some of y'all already have a priest collar queued up in your Amazon cart after we talk about this. I'm not vowing celibacy for life or whatever. But I'm just saying these are things we have to think about, that I'm thinking about where I am. And I'm hoping that these principles can help you where you are, where we have to remember that there are multiple sides to this. And what do we want to happen? Well, we want to have happen what Dennis was talking about this morning. That's in verse 17 here in 1 Corinthians 7. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. So that's what I want in my life. I know that's what you want in your life. We just want to lead the life that God has assigned to each of us. We just want to glorify him, whatever happens. So before y'all pity me, I'm not stressing about this, all right? I just want to use it as an example because whatever happens in life, I want to be God's will. And I know you want that as well. Now, this is one area where that does affect the creation, the Christian convictions about creation. All right, let's move to our second conviction. This one will go by very quickly. The Christian conviction about the Christ is another conviction that gives rise to this tension in our lives. John 1 verse 14 tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus, the Christ, became flesh and dwelt among us. He became a citizen of us, right? He became one of us. He took on our flesh, our temptations, our weaknesses. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, he was tempted in every respect, like we are, yet without sin. So he became a citizen of us. He was in the world. He participated in the world. He adapted to the world. But John 1 verse 14 isn't the only verse in John 1. We also have John 1 and verse 11, where it says that he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. We killed him. Why? He was one of us. Why would we murder one of our own? Well, because he was a citizen, but he was also a refugee. He was in the world, but he was also not of the world. He was 100,000% sold out to authenticity and love and grace and mercy and justice and holiness and purity. And the people who weren't sold out to all of those things hated him for it. And so they killed him. He was a refugee here on planet Earth, even while he wore our flesh as a citizen. And it took both. It took him taking on our flesh to meet us in our lowliness, but it also took him staying out of step with us to be the perfect sacrifice for us. We needed both of them. This tension that he felt and that led to his murder was needed. It was necessary. It was a good thing. But for us, our purposes tonight, what we want to note is that just like he had that tension in his life, that he was in the world, but he also wasn't of the world. Well, what does he say in John 17? It's also true about us. We're in the world, but we should never be of the world. So we should feel that same tension in our lives. Third conviction that gives rise to this tension. The Christian conviction about conversion. Conversion. When we're converted, we become a citizen of heaven. Philippians 3 verse 20, right? Where our citizenship is in heaven. So we're citizens right now. We're citizens of heaven. We're not primarily citizens of this world anymore. So the moment you put your faith in Jesus, you're baptized into him, you are immediately a citizen of heaven. But you don't really look like it, do you? We don't come up out of the water with a brand new name tag that says, "Hello, my name is Heavenly Citizen." We don't come out with a new passport that's stamped with heaven's flag. It doesn't work like that. In fact, when we come up out of the water, we're often disappointed to find that we are the exact same person that we were when we went in the water. We still have the same weaknesses. We have the same doubts. We have the same fears. We have the same temptations. In many ways, nothing about us changes immediately. But we're counted righteous, which is the most important thing that happens there. We're counted righteous in God's sight. But then it's a day-by-day transformation to become more and more and more like Jesus, more and more righteous. That's why we have a text like 2 Corinthians 3:18, which says that as we behold the glory of the Lord, as we look at Jesus, we begin to look like Jesus. As we look at him, we're transformed into that same image from one degree of glory to another, Paul says. So that last phrase, from one degree of glory to another, is so important because it tells us that this is not an immediate, just snap thing that happens. It happens in degrees. That's why we have just a couple verses earlier in 2 Corinthians 3, I think verse 16, he says that we don't lose heart because even though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. So this is how this works, right? On our oldest day physically, on our weakest day, or our weakest day physically. Ideally, we'll be at our strongest spiritually because we've been able to walk with Jesus longer. We've been able to look at him, as Paul says in verse 18, longer. So that's how this happens. And that's how many of you I'm going to look at the ceiling, older members here inspire me. Because even though your outer self may be wasting away, Paul said it, even though your outer self is getting weak, because that's what happens as we get older, right? Your inner self is being renewed. And for us young people, it's an inspiration because we can see what happens when you walk with Jesus for a lifetime. It changes you into a really, really good thing. So, this is our conviction about conversion. We're converted, but we also have to be transformed. Conversion is not the same as transformation. So imagine that you are a missionary. You're going into a culture that has never heard the name Jesus once before. They've never heard of him. They don't have many of his values, but you go there and you're telling them the good news and they're coming to faith, they're being baptized, and things are changing in that culture, one person at a time. But not everything is changing just right away, right? Because they're just getting baptized. It's not like they understand everything about God's will for their lives, about the Bible, about Jesus. They don't understand everything. Neither do we when we're baptized. And they're starting at a lower place in terms of they have none of the Christian values that our culture may have. So we wouldn't expect them to look like Jesus, really at all, when they're baptized. Now, in the same way, when we're converted, it's not the same. We are counted righteous, but we don't look very righteous. Thankfully, we have Jesus' righteousness covering for us. But the Christian conviction about conversion says that this tension comes because even though we are counted righteous, even though we are converted, we're also being transformed every day. We're trying to be better every day. And there's going to be a tension that comes with that between who we say we want to be and who we actually are in our daily lives. That's how it's supposed to be. But hopefully we're narrowing that gap every day. All right, last conviction. Conviction number 4. The Christian conviction about the kingdom gives rise to this tension. The kingdom. So the kingdom is already here. I think we would all say that. In Luke 11 and verse 20, Jesus says, "But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out these demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." So even when Jesus was here, even before he died and went back to heaven, the kingdom was already here on earth in some sense, to some degree. The kingdom was already here. Jesus says that if it is by the hand of God that I'm doing these miracles, that means the kingdom's here in some sense. Now remember, in the Jewish way of thinking, this kingdom is something they've been anticipating for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They've been waiting for this Messiah to come and throw off their oppressors, in this case, the Romans, throw them off and take over the world and establish this new reign of righteousness and holiness and justice. That's what they've been waiting for. That's what they think the kingdom is. But then Jesus comes and he says it's not going to look exactly like that. In fact, it's already here in some sense, just by me doing this good deed of casting a demon out. So that's when Jesus is here. Now let's fast forward to Colossians. He's back in heaven. Colossians 1 verse 13 says that God has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us, notice this phrase, into the kingdom of his beloved Son. Notice that past tense. He's transferred us in the past into his kingdom. Now, in order for them in the first century to have been transferred into the kingdom in the past, the kingdom had already to be in existence, right? See what I'm saying? Kingdom already had to exist. So the kingdom was here on earth, even then, and it's also here now. So there's one side of the truth, the citizen side of the truth. The kingdom is already here. It's arrived. We're in it. We have a king. We have a few dum-dums. We have a king. We have a dumb. So we have a kingdom. It's here. That's one side. But there's another side to this truth. Luke 19 and verse 11. As they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. So he's close to Jerusalem. Remember that Jerusalem is the power center of the Jewish nation at this point. He's close to there. And the disciples are in this Jewish frame of thought. They're thinking, okay, he's here. It's time. His ministry is coming to a close. It's time for him to throw the Romans out of Jerusalem, take over, and be our king. Establish that kingdom here on earth. Jesus then tells a parable to say, you're anticipating this kingdom moment at the entirely wrong time. That's what he says in verse 12. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. So he says, I'm going to go to this far country, receive a kingdom, and then return. In other words, I'm going to die and go to heaven for a long time. This kingdom thing isn't happening in its fullness right now. So the kingdom is here. Colossians, the kingdom's already here. But that hasn't happened yet. Luke 19:12 hasn't happened yet. So it's here, but it's not here in its fullness. It hasn't been fully consummated. So we're here in this age, in the overlap between where the kingdom is not yet fully here, yet it is here, and we're torn. We know that we're citizens of planet Earth. We have to deal with voting, polls, and social issues and wars and other earthly matters. It's very clear every single day that we are citizens here on planet Earth. But we also know that we're citizens of heaven. We know that it's over. It's done. We are home because we're citizens of our eventual eternal home. So we're already through. We're citizens. But we're also citizens here, which means that we're also refugees here. So yes, confrontation with the world. But also, yes, adaptation to the world. Yes, separation from the world, but also, yes, adaptation and participation in the world. Yes, in the world, but no, not of the world. Yes, becoming all things to all people so that we might save some, but no, not being conformed to the world. Yes, to citizen, and yes, to refugee. Why? Because the earth is God's. He owns it. And yet, it's fallen, and it's broken, and it needs to be redeemed. Why is all of that true? Because Jesus came as one of us, but then we killed him because he wasn't fully one of us. Why is that true? Because we're converted and we're counted righteous, but then we have to become what God already counts us to be. And why do we have those categories? Why do we have this tension? Because the kingdom is already here in tremendous power, but it's not yet fully consummated in its fullest form. So there it is, 4 convictions that give rise to this tension that as I've been studying it, I've been feeling it more and more in my life, seeing how it applies. This is very real life stuff to the decisions that we have to make, both big and small. So next week, hopefully, we will finish out this series by talking about some contemplations, talking about how we reason through things like this in real life. If there is something that you need to make right tonight, publicly, won't you please do that? There's no better time than tonight. Please do it as we stand and as we sing.